Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. And thank you for joining us yet again. I'm Larry Cooley, and with my co-founder and compatriot and dear friend Johannes Lynn, we're very happy to invite you back for what's the 12th of 12 sessions we've had in this year's annual meeting. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure I've had of being in all 12, but I can say that honestly, there's not a one that I haven't thoroughly enjoyed, and I bet many of you who've been with us have had the same experience. It's been really a terrific opportunity to watch the state of the art in scaling really improve before our very eyes. The quality of this year's conversations compared to past is so far ahead that it almost stuns me. I'm not only am I delighted by that progression, but I'm delighted by the progression in the number and the range of voices from around our community, most definitely including this year from the Global South, who've participated not just as active listeners, but as huge contributors to the conversation. So I think it's fair to say, to be perhaps too cute by half, that scaling up is really scaling up, and it's really a joy to watch that happen. For any of you who may not have been part of the process until now and who are just tuning in for today's session, I really want to invite you to become part of this community. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. It's a great group of people and as close to a true community of practice as I've ever had the pleasure of being part of. Everybody's in here for the joy of helping everybody else and themselves. Everybody's a learner, everybody's a teacher. It's just like what the books say a community of practice should be, and you're all cordially invited to be as active in that community as you're disposed to be. At the beginning of this session 2 weeks ago, I introduced it by saying we were 900 strong. I can now say we're well over 1,000 strong. This is 1,000 people who care about and are deeply involved in trying to professionalize the act of scaling, whatever sector they happen to be in, whatever platform they happen to be operating from. So welcome one and all. I'll say just a word or two about today's session. First, a couple of logistics to remind people the sessions are recorded. That's a little bit for our benefit, but it's mostly for yours. So we're going to be posting all of the recordings and notes and anything else we've got on the Community of Practice website, which I'll put in the chat box now. It's www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. Each of the working groups has a landing page there, and each of the sessions, along with lots of other stuff, is there. So it's also the place to send people if they want to register for the Community of Practice. It's our all-purpose go-to place. We just created it this year. It's still got work to be done, so bear with us as we make it a little bit more user-friendly, but there's a ton of stuff there already, including all the stuff from this year's annual meeting. Second thing I wanted to ask is that if people would stay on mute, and off camera, except when they're asked to come on or when they have a comment to make, but do not stay off the chat box. In fact, the opposite. Go on the chat box. It's been hugely productive the last 11 sessions, and we're kind of counting on you this time because we have questions we desperately want feedback on. So please do go into the chat box. I'll give you a couple of more prompts on that as we go through the morning. But if you have any thoughts, questions, issues, anything's fair game in that it will respond to as much as we can during the session. Anything we can't will be grist for what happens afterwards. Now, let me just bridge, if I could, specifically to this session. So this year we did something very different. This is the 6th annual meeting of the Community of Practice. And in the first 5, we basically were sharing knowledge among ourselves about things that we honestly felt were unresolved issues in scaling, where we thought we had a lot to teach one another. That was again our intention this year, but we added on a piece, and I think it was a big piece, which is that we committed ourselves to trying to advance some of these issues and develop knowledge products that we could share among ourselves and also with a broader community. And this year's annual meeting has focused particularly on those knowledge products. So the first one of those was to try to define what we ended up calling a new consensus about scaling. What are the issues? What are the points of view about those issues? What are some of the evolving questions? Then we chose out of that menu, you might say, several things that we thought were of sufficient interest to be first up for our community to handle. So the first one we picked was this issue of the relationship between systems reform and scaling. It was a little bit of an I'm from Mars, you're from Venus situation, but we had a strong instinct that the two sets of perspectives had a lot to contribute to one another. So we commissioned a working paper on that. We've continued to evolve that, and several sessions during this annual meeting focused specifically on that issue. I think we've really moved that ahead, and I'll leave it to you to see if you share my conclusion, but it really feels to me like we're almost at a landing point on that one. The second issue had to do with how changes that originate outside government go about being scaled up within government, what we called institutionalization. And we've looked at that both from a monitoring and evaluation point of view and from an operational point of view. And again, we had several sessions on that this time. To my mind, we're about halfway through an important learning agenda on that one. Third one we've raised and we're going to be talking about today, which is, are there some core principles and lessons and guidance across sectors that we can really generate and share among ourselves and with others about what it really means to be serious and thoughtful and substantive and organized about scaling. And again, I'm hoping we can both present that, but also interrogate that in the session today. And finally, we've teed up, but not yet dealt with as fully as we would like, the issue of how scaling gets mainstreamed within donor organizations. We had a session on it this annual meeting. It's our intention to take that forward. So again, at the end of today's session, after we talk about the issue of principles, we're going to come back to that broader agenda. So I encourage you to be thinking even now, as you look forward to the next year and thinking selfishly in terms of what would be most useful to you. Think about what you'd like this community of practice to continue working on or to start working on that might bring us together and move us ahead. So with that, let me transition to today's principal topic, which is principles. And on that, I'm going to, in just a moment, turn to my friend and colleague, Johannes Lynn, to get us started, but I'll just say one word by way of launching that. This has been something that has puzzled a lot of us for a long time because the nature of this community of practice is to start with a variety of different sectors and themes. And so almost by definition, we come to this from somewhat different places. And the question was, could we find a set of principles or concepts or lessons that were sufficiently common and yet not trivial, that we could put them forward as a way to guide ourselves and to guide others? And to my mind, again, I'll leave it to you to judge. I think Richard and Johannes have done a beautiful job on this, talking to a number of you, looking at a number of things that have been written and trying to put forward their best shot at this. We're clear that as a community of practice, we're not done with this yet. This is work in progress. It's a working paper that we're proud of, but it's work in progress. And part of today's session is to try to take it the next step. So we encourage those of you who've read it to give us comments on it. Those of you who haven't, listen especially hard today, and we encourage you to read it. And with no further ado, let me jump in and hand over to Johannes. Excuse me, I'll come back after Johannes and Richard with a panel of discussants that I'll introduce then, who we've asked to give some serious thought to the paper and to where we might go from here. Johannes.
Thanks very much, Larry, and I'm so happy to see everybody this morning. It's, as Larry said, our 12th session of 12 wonderful sessions, and I'm sure today's session will again be very interesting, and I'm sure I will learn a lot once again, as I have throughout the sessions today. So my job now is to briefly introduce the why and the how of the principles paper that you may have seen, and if not, I can recommend you find it on the website of the community practice. Richard Cole, my co-author of this particular paper, indeed the main author, I would think, of the paper, will then talk a bit about what are these principles all about, what are they and what are they about, and then I'll come back in briefly and say a few words about the way forward, what we want to do with these principles. Now, if we can move to the slide that shows the step progression. No, one back, please. No, I think we're in the wrong slide set. Natalie, maybe you can find the other slide set. Anyway, the why. Why are we doing this? Larry already mentioned that we're looking for whether it is possible. Indeed, it's a bit of an experiment that the executive committee of the community of practice has embarked on. We're looking to see whether we can develop a set of meaningful, high-level, but also simple principles for scaling across sectors, themes, and domains. These would then serve as a common platform and hopefully even a common language for dialogue among ourselves in the COP, but also could serve as a tool for communicating the idea of scaling beyond the COP, beyond the community of practice, and to get more traction for this important agenda on the ground among development practitioners, as well as among development funders. And finally, we think it's possible, potentially possible, to actually use these principles as a basis for advocacy for change in the way development business is being done, with a much greater, we would hope, focus on the scaling agenda. Now, I should say there was some skepticism among the community of practice when we started that effort to develop some principles. But in the end, we all came around and we decided, okay, let's give it a try. It's maybe an experiment. In the end, if it doesn't work, fine. We all will have learned something. Having decided on this, and this was the first step, the ExCom then commissioned Richard Cole and myself to prepare a draft working paper on scaling principles. And you'll see at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the URL where you can find the paper. And we came up with a draft working paper, which is now available, which proposes a set of 8 principles and 20 lessons. And these are based on a review of the literature, on expert interviews, and on the author's own experience. As a next step, we then want to discuss this paper. We got input from the executive committee, and we hope, of course, today to get input from you all. And we will then, based on this input, we will then develop, we expect, at least try to develop, a 5 to 6 page paper focusing on principles and lessons that we would share with all of you. And that then takes us to the last step in this progression, which is that we would hope we could subject these principles to testing and validation by all of us, by all the members of the community of practice, but also further refine them over time to adapt them to particular contexts, including sectoral, thematic, and country contexts. So this would be the final step in this process, which would take us some time, but I think could be, from my perspective anyway, could be very interesting. Now let's then go to the next slide, please, and quickly say a few words about the approach that Richard and I took in preparing this paper. We were guided by a subgroup of the executive committee, and based on their advice, we reviewed 16 publications that we thought were relevant to scaling in developing countries and the principles we were trying to develop. And also, we conducted 8 key informed interviews with experts on scaling. Based on that evidence, if you wish, we developed a set of categories under which, or questions under which, the large number of principles that we came across could actually be grouped and further developed, and then followed an iterative process of deciding which of these initial long list of principles we could actually categorize as principles, as against lessons, as against guidance that we thought might be provided as part of our exercise. So based on this iterative process, we then selected our final principles and lessons, 8 principles and 20 lessons, based on 3 criteria. First of all, were they actually mentioned, and how many of them were mentioned, how often in the majority of sources that we consulted? How did we, as authors with some maybe 60 years of experience among ourselves on scaling, how did we feel about which were most useful and helpful? And finally, also, of course, we were influenced by commentators and comments we received on early drafts of the paper that we circulated among limited number of reviewers, to whom, by the way, we're very grateful for their inputs. So this was the process. Next slide, please. And just to introduce the set of principles we came up with before Richard takes over, here you see in a simple graphical presentation the 6 questions that we asked, and to which the 8 principles and 20 lessons we believe respond to quite effectively. The first question is, what's the vision of scaling that you should embark on? Secondly, what is the innovation? What is the intervention? What's the model or the practice that you actually want to scale? The third question is, who is doing the scaling, or who should be doing and who should be involved in the scaling? The fourth question is, so what plan do you actually have, and can you develop? What strategy can you develop for scaling? And finally, along the circle is the how, the implementation, the actual implementation process of scaling. But finally, the last question is around evidence, and we put that at the center because evidence, what is the evidence for each of these particular steps, if you wish? What is the evidence that should drive you forward in terms of the decisions you're making? So evidence pervades everything, the question about evidence. So with this, let me turn it over to Richard, and Richard will briefly run you through the specific principles, and he will also give you some general comments and takeaways on the principles that we have worked on. Richard, please.
Great, thank you, Johannes, and thank you, Larry, and the Community of Practice for inviting us to author this paper and to present it on a high level. The paper has, as Johannes just alluded to, not only the 5 categories he just mentioned, but 8 principles, and under each principle are 1 or more lessons. And under the lessons, we have some guidance of how to apply it, and also some caveats about where it might be most appropriate to apply it and where one might be more cautious, or the limits of application. As you can imagine, when you add up 8 principles, 20 lessons, caveats, and guidance, I could talk for a long time, so I'm just going to go over some of the high points and give you a sense of the principles in particular. The principle 1, which is about developing a shared inclusive vision, inclusive vision. I want to emphasize this because you'll see this in several of these principles, this issue of shared and inclusive. One of the things that came up in our research and we concurred with is that while historically in scaling there has been sort of a tacit acknowledgement that consultation, I would say, is quite critical with multiple stakeholders, or some participation, that we needed to go beyond that, and that scaling really needs to be much more participatory in many cases, or most cases, in terms of including all the stakeholders, and particularly local stakeholders and users, in defining what is scale, what are the goals or vision of scaling. A second part of principle 1 that you'll see here is, that isn't here, excuse me, but that's in one of the lessons under scaling, is the importance of doing this early in the process of scaling, or even in the innovation process, in getting a, as ExpandNet and others have emphasized, beginning with the end in mind. And so these are 2 of the key aspects of this idea of starting with a clear vision of what the problem is and what the solutions are. Turning to principle 2 in terms of what has to be scaled, I'm not going to really talk much about that because I think that's fairly straightforward, and just emphasize that not everything should be scaled, and that an important part of identifying what should be scaled is whether it should be scaled, or assessing whether it can be scaled. In principle 3, you'll notice there's a fairly long list here of roles that need to be played in scaling: leaders, champions, intermediaries, partners, and public and private actors. And what I want to emphasize here are 2 of these roles in particular. One is the role of partnerships. I think many of you know this, but we wanted to emphasize it. It was just obvious in all the literature and the people we talked to. Very rarely do things go to scale with one actor driving the process and leading the implementation and funding at scale. Partnerships are really the bread and butter of scaling, and organizing partnerships is quite critical for scaling, and it takes quite a bit of effort, which is often underestimated, and that is quite key. This is particularly the case where innovators don't have the resources to take something to scale, whether they lack the skills or even the incentives to scale. And in that case, in addition to partnerships, we emphasize the role of intermediaries. And many of you are familiar with this, but for those who aren't, it's the role of sort of brokering or boundary spanning, of mobilizing the resources and the partners, getting all the pieces in place and going to scale. And we found that this was another area where that was important to emphasize in principles of scaling. If innovators can't do this, somebody else has to do it and step in. And so the need for intermediaries, which we emphasize in Principle 3. In Principle 4, I could talk about this for a long time. As Larry mentioned in his introduction, we had the first plenary was about the relationship between systems change and scaling. And this was a major issue that was pervasive in everyone we talked to and most of the literature we read. It's been a long time emphasis in most of the scaling frameworks of the importance of at least aligning with system constraints and creating space for scaling. But in this case, we felt the need in these principles to go beyond that and really emphasize that the literature and the scaling practitioners who are at the cutting edge are really emphasizing the need to really think hard about taking not only a systems perspective, but increasing space for scaling or engaging in systems change. And this could go from everything from the policy enabling environment to organizational capacities and mobilizing even greater resources. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. And finally, in terms of Principle 5 on this slide, we have here the need to develop an inclusive scaling strategy. And the principal point here is, if you recall the slide that we had previously, where we had that nice diagram of the what, how, who, and where of scaling, as well as evidence. Often scaling strategies include all those pieces. Who's going to pay for this and do this at scale? Where are we scaling? And what model is being scaled? But the pieces don't align. And the key here is to make sure that those pieces are congruent with each other, that the needs, for example, of a model to be implemented at scale align with the capacities of those actors at scale who are going to fill that role. So in Principle 5, even though it doesn't say that, it's in some of the underlying lessons. This alignment of the what, how, who, and where is really the core of the strategy. Can I have the next slide, please? So turning to the last three principles, implementing the strategy at scale, one of the things I really want to emphasize here, again, you'll notice, by the way, that many of these, if not all of these principles have multiple clauses in them. Here we are talking about evidence, aligning incentives, and pursuing advocacy, and I'll talk about one of those now and another in a minute. But this issue of aligning incentives, one of the things we found is that often actors are identified by the intermediary or in a scaling strategy and pathway to implement or pay for or play some role at large scale. But getting them to do that is not to be taken for granted. And the key issue here is aligning incentives. Why would we expect someone to play a role in implementing at scale, and how can they be persuaded based on their incentives to do so? And so this issue of evidence is particularly germane for what their incentives are and sharing that information with key actors so that they are willing to be enlisted in implementing at scale and mobilizing resources to do so. In Principle 7, I think this is a major, well, maybe I shouldn't say major departure, but historically, many development projects that have been a vehicle for scaling are implemented as if they're following a script. There's a strategy that's based on the beginning, that's set at the beginning of the project. There's an annual work plan that's developed, often that gets started at the beginning, and then it's almost as if just implement whatever the strategy of the work plan says. We found in our research that scaling largely doesn't work that way. That scaling, as a famous general once said, the strategy doesn't survive contact with the enemy or implementation in this case, and scaling constantly needs to be iterated and adapted as we learn new things and through experience on the ground. And this can take quite a while, and notice the last part of Principle 7, as long as needed. Scaling usually takes several years, 5 to 10 years, and sustaining scaling efforts for that period of time is quite critical. Finally, in terms of Principle 8, this issue of evidence. And you notice that it's not only a principle, but it's one of the 5 categories that Johannes showed you in the diagram above. In Principle 8, we emphasize that evidence is important in just about every one of these other principles. It's important in deciding whether to scale an innovation. It's important in terms of advocacy, as I mentioned, in terms of persuading various actors to play a role. It's important in motivating partners. And these type of evidence go well beyond what is traditionally done in terms of proof of concept. Issues of affordability, simplicity, ease of use, how much it costs to not just deliver it, but for an implementer, a large-scale doer or payer, to actually put in place its capacity to implement this at scale can often be a major issue in scaling. And all of these different concepts that I've just alluded to require evidence. Johannes, how much more time do I have here?
Well, I think maybe move on another 2 or 3 minutes at the most, I think.
Okay. So as I mentioned, and I can have the next slide, please. Underlying these 8 principles are 20 lessons, and we wanted to highlight some of the lessons without going through all 20. And in Principle 1, one of the underlying lessons is optimal scale and trade-offs. One of the things that emerged is that even the scaling frameworks and efforts that have been around for 20 years, many of the things we read and the people we talked to emphasize that there hasn't been enough of an emphasis on the ethics of scaling and the trade-offs of scaling, and that there's been too much emphasis historically on scaling in terms of just achieving a large number of people or places and on technical impact. What we found in our research is that increasingly most people are recognizing that the problems that they are addressing in scaling solutions are very complicated, they're complex, and that there are in fact important trade-offs between narrow technical impact and other outcomes like equity and sustainability, and also issues of unintended consequences. You can think of examples, particularly in agriculture, where climate change, environmental sustainability, nutrition, food security are all implicated. And it's very important in terms of figuring out what your vision of scale is to balance and explicitly acknowledge the trade-offs between these various goals and optimum scale and to address those. I've already mentioned participation and inclusion, but this is an explicit lesson in Principle 1, and really want to emphasize this. And turning to Principle 3, I mentioned that there are 4 lessons on Principle 3 because there are all these lists of roles, leaders, intermediaries, partners, in both the public and private sector. And I talked about intermediaries and the importance of partnerships. Here I want to emphasize this. Why did we put both the public and private sector here? And what we found is that most scaling pathways tend to categorize themselves as either predominantly a public sector pathway, where the public sector plays a dominant role, or a private sector pathway, or some form of commercialization. But what we found is that in practice, it's very rarely that clear cut. And that in fact, in either pathway, the other sector usually plays a very important role. Increasingly, for example, in public health, scaling, private actors are playing an important role in delivery because public systems simply don't have the reach to cover the whole population. And in sectors like agriculture, where the private sector tends to be the go-to sector through commercializing things like seeds or agricultural practices, public sector plays an absolutely critical role, at a minimum, usually from at least approving or sanctioning the scaling effort or the particular innovation, to a larger role in providing resources, sometimes subsidies, financing. For example, as part of the SDGs, public health insurance is now a major part of the development and agenda. And even when you're scaling a health innovation through the private sector, it's often financed or is increasingly being financed by public health insurance. Can I have the next slide, please? So I've already talked about most of these, and I just wanted to illustrate again how in our framework, underneath these principles are these lessons. And the one that I want to particularly emphasize on this slide is this first point, Principle 4, Lesson 11, the importance as part of aligning with systems constraints of a viable, sustainable funding model. This is something that just came out over and over and over again in the research and the people we talked to, that in terms of aligning with systems constraints, there needs to be money. I know this is obvious to most of you, but it's quite important that there needs to be a domestic funding source in most countries. That's very rare to see long-term donor funding as a viable, sustainable approach. And this needs to be built in from the beginning. How affordable is this in terms of who can pay for this at scale? So, Johannes, without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Let's move on to the next and last slide for these introductory comments. So maybe let's just stress, Richard, that these principles lessons are not really categorical imperatives that should always be applied or applied to the same degree. Indeed, our paper stresses that there are limitations and caveats that have to be considered. But we do feel that the principles can be useful default assumptions that should be considered and indeed, to the extent possible, followed unless proven otherwise. Now, there's also the other point that we stress at the very end of the paper, which is that, yeah, scaling can be and certainly is often perceived to be expensive and costly in terms of money, staff, and time. And that it can be a constraint. So our sense is that it's really important to start simple application of principles, lessons, and guidance. And so our motto here is keep it simple, at least to start with. And once you've gotten into the habit of thinking about and acting, if you wish, on the scaling agenda, then you can dig more deeply into complex tools, complex issues, and what have you. But to start with, let's keep it simple and just make sure we actually have a scaling mindset as we proceed. Now, let me say a few more words very briefly about what do we do going from here. Having this draft background paper, what we hope is to getting your inputs today. We look forward to the comments from our panelists, of course, and we will revise the paper. We will discuss it at length with the XCOM, but then based on that, as I indicated earlier, we will prepare a short version with a key set of principles and lessons without all the detailed explanations, because we feel that one can go back to and review in the background paper. These principles then, if we can reach closure on them, would be tested going forward. They could be tested perhaps through a crowdsourcing method by developing examples and cases. And everybody here hopefully could contribute in one way or another to testing and exploring how these principles would actually be applied in practice. We could also, in the working groups, in our community of practice working groups, develop sector, thematic, and actor-specific principles based on the cross-cutting ones. We could
Johannes, we just lost your audio.
Oops, sorry. I accidentally must have pushed my button here. I apologize. So anyway, you see on the slide, we might also complement this work with developing toolkits, of which there are already many around that one could pull together and make available. So these are options that we could explore moving forward. And any suggestions you have in the coming days in response to this or today in this conversation would be most welcome, because this is still very much work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you, Richard. As Johannes just mentioned, it's our aspiration on this to basically crowdsource a product. And the working paper is the first departure, the first entree on our part into trying to do that. You're our second. So those of you who've had a chance to read it or who have any first reactions, we're keen to get those right now. We've basically, even within our mini crowd that we have here, we've picked out a few people who could really help us get started on that. And we couldn't have picked a more illustrious bunch to do that. I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to ask them to answer the same question that I'm basically asking all the rest of you. So as you listen to them, be thinking for yourself about what you believe on these issues. And I'll tell you, even before I bring them on camera, what I'm going to be asking them. I'm going to be asking them for a general reaction in terms of the utility of something of this sort, and whether they think it addresses issues that need addressing at a level that's not trivial. I'm going to ask them how they feel about the particular array of principles and lessons and guidance that are in the paper. Do they think there are some that are more important than others, or do they think there are things they wish we dealt with in a different way, or that we didn't deal with at all and we should have? And then finally, I'm going to ask for their advice on the way forward. Namely, if we were going to try to use something of this sort to be as helpful as possible to the larger community, what would we do with it? How would we go about doing that? So let me introduce the panel. For that purpose, I'll introduce them one at a time. I'll begin with Santiago Levy, and he'll be known to many of you, but for those of you who don't already know Santiago, he's had a wide variety of very high-level positions. Maybe you could bring Santiago on camera, if you would, please. Santiago, there you are. There's Santiago. Among many things that he's done, which I won't even try to summarize, he's been a vice president of the IDB. He's been the head of the Mexico Social Security Institute. He's been deputy minister of finance in Mexico. He's been a tenured professor in a number of places, including at Boston University. And for our purposes, particularly importantly, he was the author, and I'd say the prime mover, behind something called Progreso y Oportunidades, which is a remarkably interesting scaling experience in Mexico of trying to take incentive-based health and nutrition education programs for the whole country. This was something that started in government and moved through government, and has been the subject of considerable scholarship as well as learning for a number of us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Santiago from all of these different perspectives, but particularly when he was in the trenches trying to make this happen effectively. Let me now introduce Ruth Simmons to you. Ruth Simmons, can we get Ruth up on screen for a second? Ruth will be known to many of you because she's a pioneer in this whole community of practice, as well as in the scaling field long before. She's now professor emerita at Michigan State School of Public Health and a member of the ExpandNet Secretariat. And as you know, we all owe a tremendous great vote of gratitude to expand net for the scaling work that we're all now so actively involved in. Ruth has worked on a whole range of issues. She's been a genuine touchstone for us in building this community of practice, and has been in there as a member of our executive committee on almost everything. And we hope that's the way it'll stay for a long time. Thanks for being with us on this, Ruth. And finally, I want to introduce Charles Kabiswa, who probably fewer of you know, but Charles is coming to us from Uganda, where he's executive director of Regenerate Africa. And we are particularly interested to have Charles with us, not only because he's more than some of us, a real field experience on this, but also because he's been in an area that we think is a real cutting edge area where different sectors have to integrate effectively as part of a scaling strategy. In particular, in his case, health, environment, and livelihoods. And so trying to think about how all these things involve the people, the planet, and the economies really come together in a scaling formula and still try to keep to some of our principles of simplicity, evidence-based, and so on, we think is a particular perspective that Charles brings to the conversation. So I'm going to start the conversation. If maybe we could bring everybody up on screen now, Natalie. Let me start with a question to Santiago, which is my first question, namely, without being polite to us or unduly harsh on us, your honest opinion, do you think there's important work to be done here in terms of trying to consolidate a set of principles? And do you think this work, either as it currently is or as it could potentially be, makes a contribution? Is there an itch to be scratched? What do you think, Santiago?
Well, first, thank you, Larry, for inviting me, and thank you also to Johannes, and congratulations to Johannes and Richard for this paper. So I'll give you the reactions to this. I think it is useful to have a set of paper that lays out principles. One suggestion would be to think, who are the principles for? Who are you writing these principles for? And I can think of three different kinds of audiences. There are probably more, but three different kinds of audiences. One is, these are principles that are useful to governments. Secondly, these are principles that can be useful to donors. And third, these are principles that can be useful to multilateral development banks and development agencies. So to just have a little bit in mind, who do you want these principles for? The consumer of the paper is kind of, I think, important to have it in there.
Do you think it's necessary, the question, do you think it's necessary for us to choose and aim at one, or do you think there's a way to anticipate more than one in the same paper?
Well, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, Larry, but the language that you would use for the different audiences might not be exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And this is, from my experience of being in government, probably the language that you would like to use in laying out those principles is probably slightly different from the language that you would use from laying out the same principles for the development community, which is more used to. At least I'm giving you a view from Latin America. I might be wrong. This is just my reading from Latin America. This is very much guided by my own personal experience. So observation number one is to have in mind who the principles are for. And let me make an observation. If I were in the government and I'm reading your paper and I'm trying to think ahead of some development intervention that I want to scale up. So I don't know whether you fit it in one of the 8 principles, but a point that I'll make here is think of the politics in the following sense. Any scaling intervention will take time to occur. It will not be in 6 months or in a year. It might take 3 years or 4 years. And during that time, there might be a change of government. So a challenge is, how do you scale up in a political context in which halfway through the government changes? So one principle has to pick up something about, think in the design of the program, and as you scale up, that the political incentives, you did mention the word incentives, but I want to emphasize the political incentives for the next government to continue with the program, to continue with the scaling. What do I need to think of today in case 2 years from today there's a change of government from a different political party, and what would be required for that new government to be willing to continue with the intervention and to continue to scale up? So think of the politics. One last observation, because I don't want to take too much time. It is in principle for the budget stuff, and Richard towards the end did talk a lot about this budgetary sustainability. I would emphasize that, at least on the language, much more clearly. Make sure that you have budgetary sustainability, particularly if it's going to be an intervention that is funded from general government revenues. As it scales up, it'll take a bigger share of the budget, and you have to think of mechanisms to protect that share of the budget from many other claimants on that budget. And that needs to be incorporated into a principle. Think of a funding strategy that is sustainable, and clearly it's not dependent on short-run variations in commodity prices or debt, but has a sustainable source of money. Let me stop here because
thanks. It's a very helpful way to start us out, and particularly on those things that are not budget neutral or budget relieving. Ruth, why don't you pick up there? What do you think? Is this we doing something useful here, or do you think we could better spend our efforts elsewhere?
First of all, I would like to say that I so very much agree with the comments Santiago just made. And I would like to add that I think the paper makes a very, very useful contribution. Much has been written and published about scaling, but having a list of key principles with associated lessons provides an overview that is not only valuable for people like us, but can make the topic of scaling accessible to an audience that would not necessarily read the literature, but is working on scaling and has limited understanding of it. I also felt that the idea of organizing scaling around principles and then going into greater depth with lessons is a good idea, because this way one can focus on the principles and absorb those, but then also dig in deeper later. I'm sure it was not easy for Richard and Johannes to sort out what is a principle and what is a lesson, but the approach works, which doesn't mean there shouldn't be considerable editing and the addition of new principles. My reaction was also that there is an overwhelming amount of information here. So that'll require tightening the document, which I think is a tough task, given how much we've already learned about scaling and how much information there's in here. I know we will talk about this later, I think, but here I do want to repeat something Larry and Johannes, you mentioned already, that the principle statement can bring all of us even closer together, and that we once again see what we share, assuming, of course, that the statement will really benefit from intensive co-op input during this meeting and later on. And furthermore, the statement of principles could also be something like a calling card for the community of practice, for easy communication with donors, partners, government, and others, as you, Larry, and Johannes already said. I'll stop here in terms of this question.
Thank you very much. Charles, you're really coming at this, maybe of all of us, from the most grounded field experience, current field experience on this. Does this feel like kind of carrying coal to Newcastle and saying things that everybody already knows, or do you think there's something useful to be done by trying to consolidate it in this way?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And of course, I'm just picking up from Ruth and Santiago. First, appreciating the work well done by you and Richard, and of course, other members that have contributed to this product. For me, it is a lot of work, because when you read the paper, you exactly see the much work that you put in the consultation, and it is well informed and well harmonized, of course, building on some of the tools that have been existing and we are familiar to, like the expanded tools. But also the timing for me sounds very right to have this kind of a consolidated and a kind of a common set of principles, because like in Africa, East Africa, everyone or countries and actors are struggling, and they see we've got this aspect of post-COVID, impact of COVID, the urgent need to bring the climate agenda on course. We have issues related to midway SDGs, and you know, we are taking this talk and we want to try out things. All actors want to try out things, doing things business unusual, which requires innovation, creativity. So at such a time, these are very, very critical principles to help us mitigate any wrong starting and also as we do the scale up. So for me, I have noted a number of familiar principles and lessons because I've been doing a lot of work on scale up, especially multi-sectoral kind of intervention within the governments in East Africa, Uganda, and others. And it demonstrates that there's been a well-thought kind of piece of work, but I still know there's a lot more we can do together, again, from, I think, Richard's presentation, that there's need for continuous improvement, testing the applications, giving constructive feedback, and further enriching the document from a wide stake of audience.
Thanks. Don't go away. I want to ask you another question. So if you then approach it from that point of view of trying to both consolidate but also elevate certain kinds of issues, are there certain messages you think is particularly important for the paper to communicate, either because they're not adequately appreciated right now, or because you think they just help you to make the argument to government and elsewhere about what needs to be done in scaling? Did some things jump out to you as more important than others in that regard? If so, what would you, if you were going to pick one or two that really you'd like us to emphasize, what would they be?
Yeah, thanks, Sirari. I think a number of principles and a number of lessons, I identify myself with more on most of them, but you know, there are some which are outstanding. For instance, principle number one for me is very, very core, where we are mentioning beginning with the end in mind, and that element of inclusiveness and participatory nature of doing the kind of innovations and also scaling them up. Because you know, our tendency here in development, even governments and non-government actors, we plan, we do the innovations, we do the pilots, but then we plan to scale up at the end of that. So we have demonstrated this in some of the work that we've done, where we've planned for scale up, like our innovation on health of people and the environment in the Lake Victoria Basin. And this actually started from the inception, and we've registered a number of successes in all the governments within East Africa, especially Uganda. But also, I like the idea of coming up with the core elements of the innovation, where you do what we call the minimum packages, because not everything can be scaled up. You need to keep watching over that and then look around to see what is scalable and what is not scalable. And there are a number of principles and lessons which you've included, like the bringing all the stakeholders together, which is a participatory process at different levels, national and regional. But more important, I like the principle number 5, where you emphasize developing the scale-up strategy. And this is very, very important. I might talk more about it, as well as the issue of evidence. You indicate in your paper is seeing is believing, people continuous kind of documentation, and then having plans on how to promote learnings and also disseminate the information.
Thanks. Santiago, let me come to you now on focus the question a little bit more. And again, of your many hats, I'll ask you to wear the one when you were in government, and pick up on a point that I know is important in all this, which is that it's tempting when you're on the outside looking in to see this very transactionally. How do I get this intervention scaled up? But when you're in the government, you're dealing with a whole portfolio. You're dealing with the entirety of what government does. In many cases, the thing you're scaling up becomes the new normal of something. It either takes the place of something, or it refines something, or it gets added in alongside something. In articulating principles, is there a way you think we can get at that really speaks to the view of scaling up when it's in the context of a larger program of activities, maybe a whole national agenda?
So I think it's sort of in the language in one of the principles, I forgot exactly which one, but perhaps you would rephrase a little bit by saying, you're quite correct, Larry, the government is going to be made up of a very heterogeneous set of people with different interests. So one principle you want to identify your allies. You want to identify what other agencies in the government would actually want this intervention to be scaled up and would benefit because they see it as good. And you also want to identify whose interest you're going to be affecting, and you have to think about what you're going to do with them. So to give an example, just a very silly one, suppose you're doing a nutrition intervention and you're going to scale up something, but then some other government program of distribution of milk is going to be phased out. These guys are going to be your enemies, and you have to think what you're going to do with them. So to summarize, think of allies and think of maybe the word enemy is too strong, but sort of affected interest that you have to have a strategy. What are you going to do with them?
Do you think that's a currently missing principle, or something we could simply be clearer about in the way we present the principles?
I think it's implicit in, I forgot which number. So my sense is just a bit of redrafting, and it comes back to what I very mentioned at the beginning. Who are these principles for? Because the language is the language that I understand well from a development community, from an MDB. Yeah. But from the point of view of a government official, the language is there, but it's not as clear as I think it could be for them.
And after I ask Ruth a question, I'm going to come back to you on the issue of from a donor perspective and have you put on your IDB hat for a minute. Ruth, what did you think looking at this in terms of principles and where you think it's most important for us to double down? Or anything you think we significantly missed?
Okay, well, all principles listed seem very important to me, but I just want to say that principle 6 always puzzles me. The individual components mentioned are relevant, but to some extent, some of the components are already covered elsewhere or could be covered in other principles, and namely marshalling experience, aligning incentives, etc. However, changing attitudes and mindsets about scaling has not been mentioned, and is so very important that I almost feel that could be principle 6 all by itself.
I see.
And then in terms of whether principles should be added, obviously we don't want too long a list of principles, but I have some suggestions here. Charles has already talked about beginning with the end in mind. And I just want to say, yes, it's there, but make it a principle, because the principle of beginning with scaling up in mind when you design and test the intervention is so critical. So you just want to be very clear about that. That's what we want right at the beginning. Do think about it, and it deserves being a principle. Second, I wonder whether you don't want to put in something about the quality of the implementation. Which certainly in the area of reproductive health, family planning, quality of care, is so important that we don't just want to implement, it should be quality. And finally, I want to say that yesterday in the social enterprise meeting, the principle of ensuring local ownership was very much emphasized. And I really like that and think that might be a principle. I also have... Yeah.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I also have some ideas about what should be handled differently. I feel that obviously principle 1, the vision, is very important, but I think it's important not just to talk about the vision of the impact, but also about what the intervention, the innovation would look like. Of course, details about that get handled in principle 2, but to discuss innovation in visionary terms together with a vision of impact would be important. And then in terms of principle 2, one of the things that ExpandNet has found is it's important to look at the degree of change implied by the innovation. That's a really important factor in scaling up, and to recognize that there are trade-offs between the degree of change, the pace of expansion, and the resources needed. And principle 4 aligns with changing systemic constraints. This is indeed important, but you might want to add something, namely not only talk about a focus on cost, finances, and risk, but also on the existing technical and organizational capacities, as well as constraints in the larger environment.
Yeah.
The weak bureaucratic capacities that one finds, especially in the public sector, constrain scale up. And as discussed in plenary 2, we have to scale up capacities. Principle 4 also raises the question to me whether aligning with arising opportunities rather than just focusing on constraints should be discussed here as a separate principle. Of course, I know the paper refers to vary and adapting interventions with context, but I'm not only referring to adapting the intervention, but also the scaling strategies and approach. I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you. I've seen Charles, and then I'm going to come to you, Santiago.
Sorry, I'm going to have to run, Larry, because
then yes, please go ahead then.
I apologize. So if you have a quick question, and then otherwise I'll.
Well, Charles, hold on to your thought for a second, and let me ask Santiago one more question I wanted to ask him. So now putting yourself in the position of a senior official in a donor organization, we've struggled as a community of practice trying to figure out how to be most influential in getting donors to take scaling more seriously as a core notion. And one thought we have is that if we could be clear and operational in these principles, that we could help to nudge them in that direction. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on how we could be most useful and influential vis-a-vis donors' behavior on scale with a document or an initiative related to principles of scaling.
If I think of donors as either foundations or governments, not multilateral development banks, because these are loans, but sort of grant money. My sense, Larry, is that you have it already in those principles, but I would just add, when you speak about evidence, disseminate as broadly as you can. Sometimes the evidence is self-contained within a very small group of academics that are writing papers for the journals, and they're doing the control treatment, and they're very happy about all this, and they're discussing the standard errors. But for the donor agencies and for the government agencies, they want to sort of get a clear sense that, yes, there's evidence that this intervention works and that it's worth to put more money and to continue with it in a clear way, in a way that they can sort of capture. And my sense is that that's what makes them tick. And also, because they're human like all of us, if they can get some brownie points, this foundation or this government has been supporting this intervention, which is very good. So in the dissemination, that they get some brownie points for it, I think also helps to scale up.
Well, I know you have to go, and I want to thank you for your contributions on this.
I had a meeting at 10 before this event was invited, but I congratulate again Richard and Johannes, and thank you, Larry, and apologies to all of you that I've got to run a little bit now.
Well, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
All the best to you.
Bye-bye. Charles, please make whatever point you were going to make a moment ago.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I also noted maybe some areas of improvement in the document, especially the way it is addressing institutionalization. And partly those are the reasons, some of the few questions you've been asking Santiago from the government perspective, that even in the donor perspective, that the paper should emphasize embedding the interventional package or innovation within the local national institutions as well as organizations, even at donor level. So we have to see that the scale up is part of the policies, programs, budgets, but also in operational guidelines for both donors and the doers as well as the government. Otherwise, it becomes incomplete. In our case, we've noted that as a big gap that needs to be emphasized. Then also, when I read through the scale up strategy, which is one of the principles, I think principle number 5, I felt there are some core elements that seem to be missing. When there's need to emphasize the role of stakeholder participation, which is emphasized anyway in other sections, but not necessarily under the principle 5. So also to emphasize that the innovation has to be proven successful before you do the strategies. There's some bit of polishing around there which is needed, but also knowing that making strategic choices on the pace and scope of scaling up, and then how to disseminate interventions and mobilize resources and others, including monitoring the progress and outcomes. But also generally, when you read the paper, it is difficult to situate the timeline, the trajectory. There are these core 6 questions, but we can't easily know the timeline of the scale up from the document. I agree there is a natural progression in the scaling up, everyone knows that, but you sometimes lose ground and sometimes things happen. You have to start again over, but there is a natural progression. So this doesn't come out well in the paper. Again, we shouldn't forget in one of what you actually shared before in the presentation that we have to keep it as the common principles and lessons as simple as possible, much as we are proposing in new modifications and enrichment of the document. That's what I wanted to add to kind of emphasize.
Thanks. We're running out of time, but I want to come back to you, Ruth, one more time on this. In terms of the utility of the paper, let me not say utility. In terms of the best use of the paper, or of something we might produce subsequent to the paper, do you have a thought you'd like to share on that about the way forward and how to pursue something like this to best ultimate impact?
Well, first of all, a lot of what I'm going to say has already been said, but I will emphasize it. Get input from the community of practice members, not only about the idea of sharing it, but really get specific input so that all of us can own it, and that the statement really reflects everyone's perspective and learning. I think that's critical. I think ultimately, when there is a shortened document that we all agree and sort of can own, then it'll be really important to disseminate and distribute this document widely within our own, the organizations of the members of the community of practice. And I also think that, given where I come from, which by the way is the University of Michigan and not universities, Michigan State University, but
did I make that mistake?
Yes.
Oh my God, that's
But
almost unforgivable. Please be my friend anyway.
But at any rate, as an academic, of course, I will say, publish the principles document somewhere, and about what the community of practice is and what we're doing, what we're all about. I think that will be very critical. In addition, I feel perhaps couldn't one develop a list of critical stakeholders on scaling, including donors, and send the principles paper out to them as an email or some mechanism. And finally, translate the document into Spanish and French. And, of course, I was thinking, shouldn't I also add maybe local languages? Ideally, yes, because who should use these principles? As long as we only keep it in English, it won't reach to those people who speak French and who only speak French and can't, make this accessible to themselves. So I think this is something really important to consider, because we want this information to go down to the lower levels, the people who are actually doing the work of scaling as well, and not only people who can read English. I'll stop there. But I also wanted to thank you, Richard and Johannes, and say that I find this is very, very valuable. And I want to thank you, really. It's really, really big step forward for all of us. And thank you, Larry, as well.
It's with considerable reluctance that I bring this component of the conversation to a close. There's been some interesting stuff going on in the chat box, and my original intention had been to try to go to those points next. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that, but let me tell you what Johannes and I and the XCOM have decided to do instead. We're going to be doing a survey, a questionnaire, with not only you, but all of the members of the community of practice and people who participated in this year's annual meetings about exactly this issue. namely, where do we go with this work and what kind of input would people like to make? And it's a very high bar we've set for ourselves on this one to try to come up with some version of a crowdsourced document that we can honestly say speaks on behalf of the community of practice, something we've not tried to do on other issues. We've tried to say things that came out of the community of practice that we felt were interesting. This one we'd like to have represent the community of practice. And so we're going to commit ourselves to do what we can to build toward that end. Those of you who've been putting comments in the chat box, please rest assured we will scrub those very carefully. And we would invite you to send anything more that is on your mind back to us on this, either in the form of an email response now, or just wait a few days and we'll send around the questionnaire we're sending to everyone. You'll simply have had the benefit of this conversation as a way to jumpstart your own thinking, but please, please, please do respond. This is something that really will be better with everybody's input into it. I'm going to thank Ruth and Charles and in absentia Santiago for this, and of course Richard and Johannes, and then invite Johannes back to go with me into the last section of this conversation where we want to engage you one more time in where we go with the community of practice going forward. And I'll set that up just briefly and then hand to Johannes. Again, just to remind you that this year, meaning the whole calendar year, was different than years before in that we really tried to identify in advance a certain number of thought products. Some of them we feel like we've basically taken where we can take them. Some we feel like we're in the middle of, some we feel like we're just beginning. We are pretty sure that that idea of singling out some set of issues and really driving them hard and trying to consolidate was a good decision on the part of the community of practice. It required resources which we didn't in the past have or need, but we did use them and we did have them luckily this year to do that. It also required a somewhat different posture for us as a community and for the XCOM as an XCOM in reviewing these things. We feel good about all that, but we'd like to hear from the rest of you. And even more, we'd like to hear substantively whether you would encourage us to continue with some of the themes that we're already advancing, or whether you'd like to have us go on into certain other themes that perhaps we've identified or haven't even thought of yet. So for that, I'll hand over to Johannes to introduce that a little more solidly than I just did, and then we'll hear from the rest of you.
Thanks, Larry. And let me thank the commentators, both the panelists, but also the ones on the meeting chat for the comments. And as Larry said, Richard and I will be reviewing those very carefully. So in terms of the final discussion now, Natalie, can we put up the slides that you had on originally first on the next sort of cross-cutting work? Larry already in his introduction talked about the 4 or 5 areas that we have been working on cross-cutting issues. Next slide, please. Yes, so you'll see here again the scaling in systems, mainstreaming the new consensus, both in governments and in donor organizations, the information monitoring, evaluation, and learning that the monitoring evaluation working group is working on, and finally the principles of scaling. All of these are now issues which we have work ongoing. On the scaling the systems, we're actually also thinking about bringing that one to a close, possibly with a blog or a policy brief, and handing it off, if you wish, to the working groups if they want to pursue it. We have to be a little bit concerned about how many topics we can tackle at a given time. So we should probably have kind of a pipeline of issues which we tackle and then move on to others as we feel we have more or less, at least for a while, reached closure on particular issues. So the question then is, first question we'd like to get your input on, and not necessarily all today, but with a survey that we'll follow up with, and Larry mentioned that we'll try and do that in the coming days and weeks, circulate a survey. The issues that we'd like to challenge you on, if you wish, ask you about, and let's have the next slide, please. Additional possible cross-cutting issues that we might address, and these are based in the first instance on Richard Cole's paper that Larry also mentioned at the outset. There are 6 additional issues that we thought we might at some point address, And let me quickly run around this tree there where you see low-hanging fruit, such as partnerships and collaboration, flagged in as one of our principles also. Demand-driven scaling, we tend to perhaps be more too often in the supply-driven mode. Should we and how can we best change into a demand-driven mode? Costing and economies of scale and scope as part of the whole question of scalability and how you effectively manage the financial sustainability of programs at scale. The question of risks, uncertainty, and de-risking actually came up very importantly in our climate change working group session. This is now in some areas of engagement is a very important issue. De-risking, how do you get actually particular private sector actors to take the risks, especially in the early stages of scaling processes, and are there things that we can learn? Then going to the bottom, a really low-hanging fruit, although I'm not sure it's that easy. I should put that higher up, perhaps. Variance of impact and robustness. As you implement programs, what is the degree that you have to pay, the attention you have to pay to whether or not a core element of the innovation actually is maintained? The fidelity of your approach, is that maintained or not? And what a variance can you actually accept? The final area which we have identified as possible follow-up is the whole role of digital technology and digital practices that is now available to assist and support scaling up. And of course, a lot has been learned during the COVID crisis on how digital can be incredibly useful. But even before that, if you think about M-Pesa, the digitally empowered credit and payment system in East Africa, digital has huge potential for scaling. So what is the role and what is the experience? And also what are some of the risks here that of course arise as you employ digital in a very systemic way? So these are 6 issues we've identified, and we'd very much like to hear from you whether you think these issues which we ought to pursue, and whether the additional issues. And indeed, on the next slide, we've raised a number of questions which we'll put to you again in the context of the survey that we flagged. So have we identified the most important cross-cutting issues? What are we missing? And what are the priorities we ought to be setting? But then there's a second question we'd also like to get your input on, and this is, are we actually taking the right approach in addressing these cross-cutting issues through commission knowledge work under the leadership of the executive committee and in consultation with all of you? Do we have that approach right? Or are there better ways of doing that? And finally, to the extent we do want to pursue knowledge work in the way we have, or maybe in new ways, how do we best organize? And very importantly, how do we fund it? Because our financial resources so far are extremely limited. And if we scale up our knowledge work in this regard, we need to scale up our financing also, without question, and any help you can offer in this regard would be wonderful. Let me stop here, hand it back over to Larry, and I think if Jenny is still with us and is available to maybe give her first input into addressing these questions, that'd be wonderful. Larry.
Yeah, I don't think Jenny is with us right now. Let me say a word or two just to connect the dots on this. So of the themes that you've heard us talk about over the last couple of weeks, and again mentioned today, there are a couple that I think we're already committed as a community of practice to furthering. One is this issue of institutionalization, and we're producing a thought paper in the next couple of months that we'll share with all of you on this and invite your thoughts about where we go from there. The issue there is, what do we know and what can we put forward that's helpful in how you move from an innovation that begins outside of government to something that gets fully incorporated within government's offerings. And we've been highlighting some specific examples of that. We're extracting learnings from that, and we're trying to consolidate that in a product that will help people who are concerned with that particular problem. We've also committed ourselves to doing something on this issue of how to mainstream a focus on scaling within donor agencies, the point I was talking to Santiago about at the end. And we've had several conversations about that. We've had a couple of webinars. We have not yet commissioned a thought product on that, but we're keen to try to do something on that because it's a place we think our community can be of interest. We have, I would say, I'm just speaking for myself now, but I would say we have scope for one or perhaps two more major thematic issues to pursue as a community of practice during the next calendar year, and we're most definitely open to suggestions from any of you as to what you would put at the top of that list. And you can, at this moment, if people want to offer up an idea, you could raise your hand and I'll be glad to call on you, or just be aware we're going to be asking you that question in the questionnaire we send out soon. Richard, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Larry. I think one of the things that's come up in the chat, and this is not the first time, is that there is too much of an emphasis in a lot of our work on the views and perspectives of the global north. And that ranges from the scaling perspective of taking donors or innovators that are usually bringing in things from the outside, as opposed to facilitating scaling from the inside, local innovations that are being locally scaled. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things I'd like to add to the list of things for the COP to consider is how to get greater involvement from people like the Global South, and particularly innovations and scaling efforts that are being originated and generated from that perspective. I think that would be an important extension of our work.
Yeah, point well taken. And I must say, just not by way of counterpoint, I actually completely agree with that point. But one of the few silver linings to this COVID situation and going virtual is that we've had really terrific participation this year in the annual meeting from the Global South, much in excess of what we've had before. But that does not take away from the point that was raised. In fact, in a way, it emphasizes it. Ruth?
I'm trying to get okay. I just wanted to add that I think it might be important. So I have a practical point for what we might want to talk about, and that is we all have developed, or many of us have developed, tools for scaling. I would find it very helpful if we had a discussion of what are all of these tools that we have across sectors, to know what they are, and perhaps they could be even utilized across sectors. I would find that very helpful. But I want to endorse also what Richard was saying about the global North and South issue. I really strongly endorse that point.
Anybody else have a point they want to make right now? I'm going to pause for 30 seconds to let you decide if you want to raise your hand. All right, I'm going to take that as no. Then I'm going to move us towards close here, and I want to say in the most heartfelt way I know how, what an incredible experience the last 2.5 weeks have been. I don't know if anyone else besides me has been on all 12, but a number of you have been on a number of those sessions, and I bet you there's not a person who didn't walk away with the same impression I did, which is that the quality of the discussion and the breadth of participation in those discussions was so uplifting. It was just wonderful. My head's spinning with stuff. And I can speak for, I think, for the XCOM on this, that we're really committed to trying to extract from this year as much value as we can, and to either repurpose it or just position it so that people, in addition to ourselves, have access to the stuff that was put forward. We're also very open to suggestions. As you know, this is an almost entirely volunteer proposition, so we can't do things if some of you don't also raise your hand to do things as well as to suggest them. But any ideas are game. We're game for it at this point, and I think it's a real labor of love for those of us who've been moving this forward. I will put in one more word on top of Johannes's about resources. This is not a pass the hat moment on this, but I want you to understand how we've done this, which is for the first 4 years of what are now 6 years, we didn't ask for or receive a nickel. We basically said, if we want this to be the kind of community of practice that it's turned out to be, we do that best by having no donor. Well, that have benefits, but it also imposed limitations. And 2 years ago, we created the concept of what we call sustaining members, borrowing it from National Public Radio, where everyone's a member, but some people are in a position to contribute, and we asked if they could. And a half a dozen organizations put in typically $30,000 each over a 2-year period. And then a couple of organizations that didn't have access to those kinds of resources, we created a different category we called contributing member. And they contributed what they could on this. And that didn't make them more important or better than anyone else, but it did help us to do some things we couldn't have done otherwise. We're going to revisit that concept this time around, and if any of you have any suggestions on that or happen to come from organizations that can help, please let Johannes or myself know, and we'll be sure to follow up the best way we know how. I want to, just for myself, end by saying a huge thank you to everybody involved, including, in my case, to the MSI team that really made this all possible logistically and technically, and worked, I can't tell you how many hours to do that. For me, it's been a hugely gratifying experience, and I'll thank you quite personally for that and hand it over to Johannes to do the same.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you for your wonderful partnership in this enterprise. It's been personally for me a wonderful experience to work with you on this, so thanks very much. But in terms of next steps, let me just mention for all of you still online now, look to the next newsletter for summaries of takeaways from each of our 12 wonderful sessions. And like Larry, I participated in just about all of them, and was like I was just blown away by how terrific and substantive and lively they were. So thank you, and I want to thank at this stage all the chairs of the working groups that were so instrumental in making these many sessions happen. I mean, to put 12 sessions together in in basically, what was it, 20 days or 18 days is quite remarkable, and we couldn't have done it, absolutely could not have done it without the commitment, the energy, and the imagination of the working group chairs. So thank you very much. But of course, we also had terrific panelists, speakers throughout. So thank you to all of those, and to everybody who participated, because your participation in the chat and occasional personal interventions were just terrific. And we have, as Larry said, kept track of these. Finally, I'm not part of MSI, Larry is. I'm not part of MSI. So on behalf of everybody who did participate over the last 20 days, I want to thank the MSI team. You guys have been just truly outstanding, and thank you so much. You've been all in the background. If you can show your faces maybe briefly, that would be really special, because even I haven't necessarily met you all, which is kind of ridiculous, to be clear, but that's
Natalie Reddish, Sean, come off Sean, second and on camera.
Yes, please put on your camera if you can, and wave at us, please, because we want to see you. Where are you? Oh, man. Okay, you're shy. All right. Well, let me then maybe, Larry, should I close?
You should.
All right. So thank you all, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you're this side of the Atlantic. And otherwise, just enjoy a remainder of a good week, and then a weekend, and the holidays that are coming soon. Take care, everybody, and thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, and happy holidays to you.